So anarchy sounds good in theory, but it's never been tried, huh? Wrong. Retreat with me to the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. The year is 1815 and the Congress of Vienna is redrawing the map. All agree, the French must be restrained. To do that, leaders set up a demilitarized zone between the Netherlands and Prussia. The area was called Neutral Moresnet, a triangular land area world leaders argued would ward off further war and promote peace, as it housed a very important zinc mine that the empires could share. Moresnet began with a population of only about 250 miners living between the triangle and their respective homelands. Aside from its economic benefit, the territory went largely unnoticed. It saw the creation of neighboring Belgium in 1830, as well as a rash of bloody revolutions around Europe in 1848. With no one to rule it, those who lived in Moresnet did so rather anonymously. Unfortunately, Moresnet could not stay a secret forever. Amid the growing fever of imperialism and nationalism, peoples began to hear of a land with no tariffs, low taxes, no war, one court, and only a handful of government officials. By 1850, the population had doubled, bringing in businesses, farms, and infrastructure. Between 1858 and 1860, the population quadrupled. Moresnet had turned into a boom town. The German Empire and Belgium attempted to assert their dominance in the region by shutting down a private postal service and casino, but could not thwart the independent spirit of the Moresnetians. As their few government officials retired, stability in the nation continued. A small competing court system sprang up, and taxes dropped to zero. Even when the mine dried up in the 1880s, the residents had little to fear. Strangely enough, Moresnet saw even more prosperity. Immigrants who learned of a country free of bureaucracy, strife, taxes, moved from places like Russia, America, and even China. One such newcomer was Dr. Wilhelm Molly, the town's resident Renaissance man and champion. After some medical and entrepreneurial adventures, Molly extended a hand to the anti-state Esperanto speakers. Their influence was so heavy that the residents changed the name from Moresnet to Jericho, or a place of friendship. Visitors and residents often remarked on the area's bohemian yet modern atmosphere. At a population of about 4,000, Americans enjoyed as an ease of life that contrasted sharply with their militarized industrial neighbors. But the happy mistake that was Jericho could not last forever. When the Great War came, the German Empire swept across Europe, taking the triangle with it. And as strangely as it had come into existence, Moresnet, or Jericho, disappeared. Though it was short-lived, we should not forget the legacy of the triangle. For decades, people did manage to live without a central authority. While Europe grew even more impervious, Moresnet built a new society based on free trade and liberty. In defiance of the norm, Moresnet could have served as a blueprint for the new Europe. But Moresnet doesn't exist anymore, you might say. It might have been fairly recent, but it only lasted about 100 years. It had a population smaller than most American towns. How can something like that work with a modern population and standard of living? I will answer those questions, but first let us look at Ireland. The particular form of anarchism that existed there was called Brehon law. Remember, anarchy does not mean no rules. It means no rulers. Brehon was a type of polycentric law. Polycentric law is based upon the idea that sometimes people will disagree, but that doesn't mean the state should have a monopoly on justice. Instead, competing courts arbitrate disputes as provided by the open market. The rulings are compensatory, meaning that instead of chopping off a thief's hand or throwing him into a pit of snakes or prison, for example, he simply has to pay some value of stolen goods or other means of restitution. So instead of laws, as we think of them, these courts followed principles or rules, values put forward by society and demand from the market. For example, stealing and killing is bad. Centuries ago, the Celts inhabited the Emerald Isle. Of the various customs the Celts had, they prized private property, reputation, and freedom. It would be dishonest to say that ancient Irish society wasn't hierarchical or primitive. It was. But it was their hand-to-mouth existence and their rituals that most tribes kept, which sustained Celtic communities for centuries. A patchwork of clans and provinces, Irish society managed to elevate every individual to a level where society worked like a well-oiled machine. From its inception, Ireland was unique. Though its history is steeped in blood, beneath the kettle burns a fire of liberty that no power has ever managed to put out. It's worth noting that the Romans never invaded Ireland. This meant, unlike most of the conquered nations, the Irish were never taxed by Rome, militarized by Rome, or most importantly, subject to Rome's complex legal and penal codes. When two parties in Ireland had a dispute, they would just take it to their local brehon. The brehons were educated elders who acted as judges, but unlike judges, brehons didn't expand on the law or impose sentences. Instead, they interpreted and preserved traditions. The exact laws that the brehons passed down were changed, written, and rewritten as time went on. So historians still debate on specifics, but what we do know is that Ireland was surprisingly progressive. Capital punishment was non-existent. Women could divorce and were entitled to a portion of the estate. Nobles held the same legal status as shepherds. Even the courts were impartial. When a brehon delivered an unjust ruling, it was not uncommon for him to forfeit his fees and other wealth, and in these cases he would lose his standing within the community. If an agreement could not be reached, the opposing parties would bring their case on appeal to another brehon. While participating in the process, the parties would also attempt to mediate outside of court, as they do today. Though Hollywood and historians like depicting the Celts as simplistic barbarians, equity was an ideal that the Irish held very dear. And while it may confuse people today, this was all done without any government officials of any kind. In Ireland, enforcement of law was seen as a social responsibility. If a guilty man refused to give restitution, he was cast out by the community, an exercise of their right of free association. On the occasion that he was even permitted to live within the village, the people would not give him shelter, and certainly not trade with him. The man would then be faced with paying up, finding another brehon to go to, or living alone in the wilderness. If a non-payer still insisted on living at home, the victim would starve himself or herself publicly, probably originating the hunger strike. If an accused party believed he or she was innocent, there were a number of avenues to appeal to the community and to the courts. Though compassion was important to the Irish, to continually aid a non-payer was not taken lightly. To do so would be to tarnish one's honor and reputation by giving blessing to a wrongdoing. While we may never know the exact methods and accounts of every dispute, we can still say that even without police to speak of, the Irish got along fine. Even after the introduction of Catholicism, brehon survived. When the Roman Empire fell, brehon survived. Even though war after war with neighboring England, brehon survived. The innovative, free-spirited Irish continued to cope with changes while preserving their anarchic traditions. It wasn't until the English finally conquered the island in the 1600s that brehon was finally abolished. If you're still not convinced, don't worry, there's more. Polycentric law didn't end with the Celts. More alternatives to the violent monopoly known as the state can be found far away across oceans and deserts, where two unlikely societies challenged authority: Iceland and Africa. Norway was changing fast in the 10th century. Up until then, it mostly resembled Greece. Direct democracy was the system used by Norwegian men and women who lived in a patchwork of petty kingdoms. Each state had an earl, usually a wealthy aristocratic warlord who presided over a general assembly, where people from the area could come to discuss any issues and disputes of the day. Unfortunately, Earl Harald Fairhair grew ambitious and sought to unify these states under his banner of a united Norway. While some saw his actions as an attempt to genuinely bring people together for common defense and peace, others viewed it as a brash, tyrannical power grab. So, like many groups before and after them, the people who wanted freedom left their homes, settling for a recently discovered island to the west, Iceland. The new settlers brought their traditions with them, as did other Irish settlers not long after. It's still debated among academics about what exactly happened to create the new social order known as Verdhorth. Some more statist thinkers claim a group of warlords or chieftains banded together to create a new general assembly like an ancient congress, that would lay a foundation for Iceland's modern democracy. Others, like David Friedman and Roderick T. Long, however, contest the narrative and instead posit with ample evidence that Iceland was more or less an anarchic paradise. Like its landscape, Iceland's political climate was bare, but beneath the surface, change was coming. There were no earls or kings, no seat of power, but unlike a certain group of fictional schoolboys, the inhabitants didn't kill each other and burn everything to the ground. It's surprising, but it was their best interest to just get along. For one thing, the women of the time were relatively respected. This was likely a carryover from Norway and Ireland, where women owned property, divorced their husbands, and fought in combat. And then there's the fact that private property was sacred, as was reputation. Anyone who breached either was in immediate danger of shunning by his or her community, as well as a lawsuit. The judges who oversaw these trials were called godhars, or godhars. While some say they were chieftains, they were more likely just elders who memorized social codes and passed them on to their families via oral tradition. Together with other officials, these men formed the godhorth system. The godhors were not like the average judge. A godhor could sell his position as judge, a scenario that might give many nightmares today. But the position also hinged on being able to gather enough supporters to keep his job. This brings us to our next topic. In this system, there was no monopoly on justice. Not only were these seats temporary, private positions, but in sharp contrast to every other community, including Norway, there was no geographical state monopoly. This created a competitive environment. Parties involved in this dispute could go to argue their claims in court only after paying a fee to a judge, sometimes appointed by a godhar. If one party couldn't win a case, he had the option of appeal, going to a competing court, or finding someone with more money to protect him. This may seem like a radical and greedy system to some, but there were several checks and balances built in. In order for a judge to maintain credibility, he had to make sure the community saw him as just and an equitable man. Likewise, for a party to earn the support of moneyed folks to represent them, the party had to make sure his or her case held water, or else the reputations of his entire side were in jeopardy. So logically, there was an explosion of firms that acted as both insurance and security companies. So, as with Ireland, we see the maintenance of order as both an economic and social act born out of voluntary cooperation. 6,000 miles away, something else was happening in the hills and savannas of Africa. Some historians place it around the 7th century, some before, and others still place it a millennium earlier. It was a voluntary polycentric system that began in present-day Somalia that today is called Heer, spelled Xeer. The structure resembles godhorth in that there are judges, jurists, lawyers, detectives, and enforcers. Don't let those titles fool you, however. Xeer, or Heer, is definitely private and definitely stateless. There are no uniforms, no licenses, and no offices. In fact, court cases are almost always held under the nearest acacia tree, and where people lay out mats and discuss their cases. To make sure each party can pay, most communities urge every person to carry some manner of insurance before taking a case to court. This system is still practiced every day across Somalia, particularly in the north and west, and despite the war and poverty that have torn the nation apart, one can't help but notice how little it's changed. There are a few opinions of how old Heer is. Exactly. Some say it predates Islam, while others say it followed, and others still say Xeer or Heer may have been the basis for a trade empire, using empire loosely here, that spanned the continent. Regardless, we can conclude with solid evidence a few interesting things. Before there was even a Somali people, the tribes recognized Xeer. While Islam was also a unifying factor in Somalia, the introduction of it and Islamic law, both peaceful and aggressive missionaries, affected Xeer, but did little to transform it. And lastly, Xeer's traditions are held even above Islamic law, for not only does it take precedent in cases where Xeer and Islam conflict, But in almost every case, someone who holds a position like a judge or detective cannot be involved in the clergy at all. Aside from religion, Zir takes a sharp digression from politics as well. After the decay of the sultans, European powers invaded Somalia, targeting their rich ports and established colonies. Neither the tribes nor what remained of the sultanates could stand up to the industrial might of the West. Britain and Italy both exerted heavy pressure on the population to adhere to written laws and costume dictators. It was the Europeans who, confused by the mere existence of Zir and Sharia living partially in harmony and partially in opposition, which passed a series of laws and codes, arguably promoting Sharia in official courts, thus paving a road for the Islamic Courts Union. Today, we see a similar situation where Western powers and radical Islam rage over who will rule Somalia. It was the introduction of government itself that even made these wars possible. Archaeologists have yet to find any evidence of broad conflict prior to the arrival of Muslim and Western powers, both establishing monopolies of violence where there had been none to speak of before. Many other anarchist societies have existed throughout history. Before I get into anarchy in America, however, I will mention a few in passing. Nestled in the fertile Jordan River Valley in present-day Palestine on the outskirts of an urban area some 13,000 years ago, there is what seems to be a pile of rubble whose importance cannot be overstated. This rubble is the remains of the city of Jericho. If you looked at the origins of the society, there's hardly a better place to look. And rest assured, Jericho was a city of wonders. Biblical archaeologists and anthropologists have obsessed over this city ever since the first shard of pottery was discovered there. The city, they realized, actually has about 20 consecutive settlements built over each other. The original inhabitants can only be termed geniuses. These people drew the blueprints for all the towns in the future. The most amazing thing, though, is they did this all without absolutely any government. Jericho lasted for about 9,000 years with no government. 9,000 years. Located in modern-day Pakistan, Harappa is considered by many to be the home of the Indus River Valley civilization and to civilization itself. Harappa lays claim to many achievements. For example, researchers have found some sort of writing all over the area, which slightly predates cuneiform and Phoenician. What's really unique about Harappa, though, is its organization. Not only are there roads, but the area is laid out in an almost grid-like pattern. In the cities, there is municipal drainage and other definitive evidence of public services being provided without a government. On top of the uniform writing system, there is a system of uniform weights and measures used by traders and merchants. The religious figurines and children's toys, though they do not indicate an organized, collectively recognized cult, indicate a sort of cultural homogeneity. It was spontaneous order played out in real life. Not only did this work, but it made civilization flourish. There is more than enough evidence to indicate that the Harappians traded with everyone they could. Namely, they traded with their neighbors to the west, the Mesopotamians. Though the Mesopotamians were statists and the Harappians were not, the Harappian society was so advanced, in fact, that there were several families or companies that traded in and outside Harappa as far as Indonesia and even Egypt. Located in modern-day Turkey, near a twin city of volcanoes, is the settlement of Çatalhöyük. Yeah, I have no idea how to say that, and I've found no person that can pronounce it correctly. So if you're from the area, I'm sorry I'm not doing it justice, but I can't say it. I'll try though. I'll try my best. So this Çatalhöyük, like I say, was located in modern day Turkey and vies with Jericho actually for the oldest settlement on Earth. Coincidentally, the settlers of this area not only traded with Jericho, but like Jericho, had several consecutive settlements built on top of each other, about 18 actually, and they were just as innovative. While there existed no written account of these places, so it's impossible to have a first-hand account declaring that there was no government, researchers use the same techniques they do for in any other civilization when locating evidence of government. They look for public buildings mainly. It seems simple, but for governments to function, they need offices, they need congregational areas, they need administrative centers, armories, treasuries, etc. They look for areas of concentrated weapons, areas of concentrated wealth, researchers do, and for evidence of tributes or evidence of the worshipping of humans. None of these things were ever found in Jericho, Çatalhöyük, or Harappa. In contrast, in the Chaldean, Assyrian, Persian, Syrian, Egyptian, and Babylonian civilizations, which are near the same age, all of these things were found. There was simply no plausible evidence that the aforementioned places, 3 places, were governed. So that brings us to modern times. Here's a fact you may not be familiar with. America was founded by anarchists. Just to be clear, I'm not saying the founding fathers were anarchists, but the peoples that first settled the territory were. Take Pennsylvania, for example. Founded by William Penn in the late 1600s, the colony of Pennsylvania was settled mostly by members of the Society of Friends, or more commonly called the Quakers. Though they weren't the first or only group to practice religious anarchism, the Quakers, or Society of Friends, were a special group of people with no formal ties to any organized body. The Quakers have always celebrated individuality and uniqueness. Most people in the 1600s didn't like this. Amid constant wars between theocrats, the Quakers found the common denominator in this chaos and sought to eliminate it: the state. Cast out by their peers as a fringe sect, the original Quakers sought places where they could freely practice their faith. The young and promising America provided such a haven, and they needed one. Though their members still differ widely on the political spectrum, many Quakers have a penchant for anti-statism. Holding pacifism as a central tenet of Quaker life, they have traditionally opposed taxes, conscription, nuclear arms, and the worship of or loyalty to the very earthly and imperfect state. And while their ideologies vary wildly from communism to capitalism, many Quaker colonies have made their living as rather brilliant entrepreneurs within their communities and outside of them. But Pennsylvania isn't alone in its dream. Throughout history, religious societies have opposed the state and have flourished. From the Dock on Dubors to the Jewish Renewal Movement, religious anarchism has a rich and tenacious history. Authors like Leo Tolstoy and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan have written extensively on how the state threatens people of faith. Even today, it is alive and well. In England, for example, the community of Stapleton, founded by a cousin organization of the Quakers, operates in open defiance still of the UK government, asserting their rights of faith, life, and liberty. Similarly are the Amish of the United States, which I could go into greater detail. But since we've covered so much already, perhaps I'll leave that for another time. But just to touch on them briefly, the Amish operate for the most part outside of government control and are exempt from most all government rules and regulations. They operate their own system of internal arbitration without police or courts in the traditional sense, where social ostracism, or what's referred to as my doom, is the punishment for violators of its religious tenets. But there is no question, the tradition of friendly, stateless life lives on, and there is hope it will continue. Another example of an anarchic society in the U.S. was a place called New Harmony, Indiana. Dissatisfied with slavery, corporatism, and other ills that infected the young United States, notable inventor and philosopher Josiah Warren closed his factory and left his home. The town of Harmony already existed, founded by one of the many religious sects during the Second Great Awakening. But Warren and his compatriot Robert Owen had a utopian vision for a new society. The whole idea for a town would be that it would run without any government administration, and that was actually Owen's idea. Robert Owen, a major proponent of the labor theory of value, and one of the founders of anarcho-communism, which, just to make clear, as a capitalist, I do not advocate. His community had a disdain for private property and individualism, which again, as a capitalist, I do not advocate. But Owen attempted to form New Harmony around egalitarian ideals. But predictably, the lack of individual incentive in private property that existed there perpetuated the experiment to fail, largely due to economic discoordination and resource mismanagement. Again, not a system I would advocate, but a stateless system that existed in the U.S. nonetheless. The failed experiment in New Harmony prompted the young and industrious Warren to pick up things and start over. For his own experiment, Warren thought he'd try something different. Individual autonomy and property rights would be key. In Ohio, he created the community of Utopia. But don't worry, he wasn't so arrogant as to name it that. It was a carryover and a name that already existed that had been placed on the area by another religious sect. But anyway, it was there that Warren began to formulate his idea of mutualism, a system of trade based around the labor theory of value. From 1847 into the early 1860s, Utopia exploded in population and wealth. Forward thinkers came to the town to set up home and shop, eager to experiment in a market economy with no regulations or laws. By the 1850s, when Warren returned from one of his many adventures, the town had several factories, stores, and other attractions. Tragically, however, the Civil War came to Ohio. As a crucial Union state, Lincoln's administration wanted to squeeze as much military might out of Ohio as possible. Warren's decision to make Utopia a by-invitation only community led to disaster when the Union bought up all surrounding land, making expansion virtually impossible. Original inhabitants stayed in the area at least until the 1870s, but eventually the state of Ohio absorbed the county Utopia is now in today. But always persistent, Warren was not finished by a long shot. While he was away from Utopia, Warren teamed up with individualist anarchist polymath Stephen Pearl Andrews. Together they founded a town called Brentwood, Long Island. From 1851 onward, the community expanded as the ideas of anarchism spread throughout the world. And this time, instead of inviting certain people, all were free to move to what the pair called, quote, modern times. Transcendentalists, teachers, doctors, hedonists, writers, entrepreneurs, and an array of other castaways formed the colony's growing but manageable population. Again, though the tides of war proved unstoppable, the Union, very present in New York, balled up or incorporated the surrounding land. Eventually, the original population dwindled, and by the 1900s, Brentwood, New York, was incorporated, and its history was lost. By the end of his life, Warren was supremely satisfied with his accomplishments. With nothing but a pen and a dream, he managed to convince thousands of people to follow his ideals, that humankind is meant to be free, without a mammoth state watching, coercing, and forcing people around. These two communities lived in absolute peace and harmony, voluntary trading and cooperating. They created the most efficient and enjoyable way of life, free from the contemporary horrors like slavery and conscription. Instead, they bloomed. With these examples in mind, and many others that exist that I simply don't have the time to go into, there is no reason that we as a society cannot replicate them.